Most automations don't fail loudly, but silently. So that means your workflow breaks at 2 a.m. and you only notice when your team or your customers complain. So in this video, I will show you an easy way how to catch every failure in n8n and send it straight into Slack. So you will never miss a broken flow again. So let's get right into it. Imagine we have a very simple flow like this, just so we can simulate an error, right? And I have a webhook right here. And the only trigger that I need is going to be the production URL right here, right? And I'm going to trigger this in a second. So this will be the trigger for the flow that we want to fail, right? And after this, I'm just using a very simple HTTP request, which deliberately calls a URL which will fail, right? Just so that we have a flow which will error. Now, the important part is, or what you could do in this case is that if you want to handle errors, right, then you can jump into the settings of a specific node and then jump into the settings and then into the on error dropdown where you have a couple of options how the flow should behave, or the specific node rather should behave if something happens in regards to errors, right? So we can just stop the workflow, which is the default option. Then we can just continue as if nothing happens, which I would not advise you to do. And then we can use an error output, right? And if I select this one, then you can see that it says the execution will continue even if the node fails. However, if we close this, then you can see that we basically have two options or two different paths that the workflow will continue with, right? And obviously this first one is if the node did not fail, the success path, then we have the error path, right? Now, technically, what we could do is that we use the error path and then send this message for Slack or whatever, or right into Slack rather, or we could trigger another workflow and, handle it that way. However, this also means that if you have a flow with, let's say, 20, 30, or 40 different nodes, that you will have to account for every failure or every node where it could go wrong or something could go wrong, and then you would need to have an exception for this, right? So this is possible, but also a little inconvenient. A more convenient way to do this is that we are going to use the flow options themselves, right? So if you open up the settings at the top right corner right here, then you can see that we have the workflow settings themselves. And then you have the second option here, which is called error workflow, which is to be notified when this specific workflow errors, right? And then you just have a drop down of all the flows within your n8n account that you can select, and that is to be triggered if any node within this flow fails. So something that we need to take care of, first of all, is to have another flow which will handle this error, right? So what I'm going to do, first of all, is that I'm going to deactivate this option again, right? And I'm going to keep it in the default settings, so stop the workflow, so that every time if something happens, the error flow will be triggered. Now I'm going to jump into the Slack alerts catch flow, which is the second flow, and here you can already see what's going to happen, right? First of all, the trigger that we need is called error trigger, which is a native node from n8n. So if I look for error, then you can see that this is already the very first option, which obviously will be triggered as soon as a specific flow fails. And the connection between this flow and the other one is exactly as I just showed you, right? So if I open up the settings in the flow that will be the trigger, right, then you can see that this is exactly the second flow that I have selected. So this is called Slack alerts catch, and this is exactly the flow that I'm using here. All right, so a couple of things to notice, first of all, is that you don't need to activate this flow, right? This is going to be handled internally, so there's nothing that we need to take care of in that regard. Then the second node that I'm using is that I am going to use a set fields node, which will basically just map a couple of fields, right, that I find valuable for the Slack message itself, so that I know, all right, what happened, where did it happen, and when did it happen. And I'm using something like the workflow name, the execution ID, and error message, obviously, which was the last node that triggered this very error node, and then when did it happen, right? And these are obviously all within the parameters of the error node. right? Or of the error trigger rather. And then I have already the last message or the last note, which is to send a Slack message to myself containing exactly this information that I have just said. So when I open this up, then you can see that this is connected to my Slack account. I'm using a message that I want to send. I want to send a specific message to a specific user, which is myself. Obviously, you can create a channel for this, right? And then I just want to send a simple text message, and this is the message that I'm using, which is just to tell it that the workflow failed, and then which was the flow, the node, the error, and so on and so forth. And then obviously these are exactly the ones that I am extracting out of the previous node, right? And this is already it. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to deliberately call the first flow, and then we will just see what happens. So I'm jumping into this flow again. And by the way, you can't use a manual trigger for this, right? So the error trigger will only work with nodes, or with flows rather, that are being triggered by webhooks or schedulers or different API calls, so you can't use a manual trigger for this. All right, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to open the webhook. Then I'm going to use the production URL right here. I'm going to copy this into my clipboard, close this. I'm going to make sure that this is active, and then I'm just going to enter it in my URL bar, and then I'm going to call it. And that's already it. So I'm getting this message back, right? Workflow has started. This is coming from n8n itself. I'm going to close this again. And now if I check the executions right here, then you can see that this was just a couple of seconds ago. When I'm looking at my watch, it's 10:22. And now you can see that indeed this flow has errored, right? This flow has failed. And I don't care too much about the error itself right now. Obviously, I just wanted it to trigger an error. All right, now I'm going back into the error trigger flow. And also here you can't see that something has happened, but if you jump into the executions tab, then now you can see that it did take not even a second, and the whole flow itself was successful. And now we can jump into the error trigger and just see what kind of information we are getting out of this. So we get an execution ID, and then within the error object, we get a lot of information like, the level and the timestamp, obviously some context headers, everything else that might be interesting in regards to debugging that specific error, right? And now you can also see when I jump into the set fields node that these are exactly the variables that I am getting out of this. So I'm using the workflow name, I'm using the executions ID, and so on and so forth. And this will be what I got out of here. And then in the very last node, if I open this up, then you can see that this is the message that I have created. Everything, all of the variables are green. And when I jump into my Slack account, then you can see that this is just the message that I have just received, right? So it's 10:22, or it was at 10:22. The workflow has failed, and now this is the flow, right? This is the flow name, 10A Slack alerts sent. This was the node that failed. This is the error message, right? And then the timing, or the timestamp rather, and then an execution ID. Now, why did we use it like this, right? Could have just connected the send Slack message node to the error trigger itself, right? But imagine you can even expand this, right? So what you could do is that you are going to route specific errors, right, to, for instance, specific channels. So imagine that within our set fields node, if we open this up, we could check if the error message contains a specific error status code, right? For instance, something like 429, which is when you are sending too many requests, right? And then you could basically route this whole flow to different kinds of paths, right? You could use a switch node for this, or you could use different channels for this, right? So you could differentiate basically between ops alerts and then ops warnings, and you have different kinds of severities in regards to the specific error, right? So you can make this a lot more complex. So this is just a gateway, if you will, in regards to making this more complex and more specific. All right, so this is already it, and this is just to give you a very rough overview how you can handle errors very, very easily, as you have seen. And if this video was helpful to you, then I would be very grateful if you liked and shared this video, and obviously subscribe to this channel, because I will be releasing these kinds of videos all the time. And then also I am building a school community which will handle exactly these kinds of topics, right? So we will get into n8n basics, we will get into building AI agents, you will get access to the n8n flows, to any kinds of prompt that we are building, to tables and what have you. At the time of this recording, the school is still free. It will be paid in the future, but don't miss out on this right now. All right, so this is already it for today. I hope this was helpful. Thanks a lot for your attention and hope to see you next time. Bye.